Hello, I'm Jim Engel. I serve as the Chief Operating Officer for Evangelism Explosion International. For decades, I have been involved in training ministry professionals through EE clinics and Billy Graham schools of evangelism. In both cases, some of the most significant impact is made not in group sessions, but one-on-one before or after group sessions. While the name and details are different, I have had an often repeated encounter again and again in these settings. Sitting with a pastor over a cup of coffee, he pours out his heart about his frustration in ministry. He feels frazzled, overworked, stretched in too many directions. In every case, this pastoral frustration has spilled over into his personal and his family life. After 20 or 30 minutes of listening, the pastor stops talking, looking at me with one word written across his silent face: help. Help me. Taking a piece of paper from my pocket calendar and giving him a pen, I asked him to do two things. Number one, list the 3 or 4 ministry areas consuming most of your time. Then I asked him to list his top 3 or 4 ministry priorities. In almost every case, there is little, if any, correlation between these two lists. In fact, often he cannot even list his top ministry priorities. Then I asked him to write down the day of the week that he takes off, a day in which he does nothing related to the ministry. Universally, the answer is, I don't have such a day in my week. Activities abound endlessly. Priorities are lost under the weight of those activities. Remember, time does not equal activity. Time equals priority. Now we come to equation number 3. Time does not equal results. Time equals preparation. A culture of instant gratification has spawned an expectation of instant results. Always in a rush, results become the altar upon which we can too often sacrifice God's precepts and our integrity. The story of Abraham and Sarah provide an excellent case study. They needed a male heir to experience the fulfillment of the promise that God had made to them. They grew impatient in their waiting, so they hatched the idea that Abraham should father a child with Sarah's maid, Hagar. The plot, which was the genesis of a problem that still exists to this day, was intended to produce results. However, in God's economy, the means to the end is equally as important as the ends attained. God was preparing Abraham to be the father of many nations. We see the importance of the period of preparation in 3 other important biblical figures. Moses was prepared for 40 years for the work he was to accomplish in Egypt as the leader of the people in the Exodus. 13 years transpired between Paul's conversion and the commencement of his first missionary journey. Jesus was in public ministry for only 1/11 of his life on earth. In each case, the results achieved were momentous. However, the results came not because of time, but because of the preparation that took place during the time prior to their recorded achievements. The quantity of time does not guarantee results. It is using time wisely in preparation that will produce the desired results. Ministers and elder boards that emphasize numbers and meetings do a disservice to the biblical view of time. Having considered our 3 equations, we now turn to the essence of our response, and that is self-control. Self-control deals with motivation and recognizes the difference between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. Of vital importance in the proper management of time in ministry is the quality of self-control. Most often when the word self is hyphenated in our day and age, it has to do with some self-promoting or self-centered end, self-esteem, self-actualization, self-expression, self-worth, all are aimed at a self-centered self-satisfaction. The Bible uses self as a hyphenated word, but very precisely. When it does, the most frequent usage of the word is self-control. It's employed 18 times in the NIV translation. It is linked to the strength of the walls of a city, Proverbs 25:28, resisting temptations brought by Satan, 1 Corinthians 7:5, the fruit of the Spirit, Galatians 5:22-23, a distinctive quality of the follower of Jesus Christ, 1 Thessalonians 5:6, the qualifications of an overseer, Titus 1:8, the effectiveness of our prayers, 1 Peter 4:7, the resisting of the devil, 1 Peter 5, verses 8 and 9, and the effectiveness and productiveness of our faith, 2 Peter 1, 5 through 8. Quite a list for self-control, isn't it? The context of each of the above referenced verses approaches self-control from its unique perspective. Positive and negative, as well as general and specific in nature, the composite impacts highlights the vital importance of self-control in the life of a Christian. Since increased leadership always brings increased responsibility, the ministry professional must take ever so seriously the call to self-control. In keeping with the purpose under consideration, we will connect the investment of time to the character quality of self-control. Character qualities are often easier to observe than define. This dilemma sent me searching the scriptures for a case study of a person who made the connection between time and self-control. Now, while the word self-control appears nowhere in the narrative describing his life and his work, Nehemiah is still an apt subject. Remembering that time is primarily purpose, priority, and preparation, and not duration, activity, and results, let's highlight some features of this unique story and this unique man. First, he invested a significant amount of time in prayer. Second, he said no to one priority, being a cupbearer for the king, in order to say yes to another priority, rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem. Next, he reminded them, the people, the project was not to rebuild the walls, but to remove the disgrace of God upon them and their city. Nehemiah employed intrinsic, internal, rather than extrinsic, external motivation in recruiting people to follow him. He stayed on task, even with repeated and growing levels of opposition against him. He proclaimed and modeled to the people that the spiritual walls of life were far more important than the physical walls around the city. Self-control. It's amazing that a project as massive as rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem could be completed in 52 days. It takes many church committees and staffs that long to decide that they better make a decision. But when we read on, coming to the great Watergate revival recorded in Nehemiah 8, we realize why he took such care to establish self-control as the embodiment of his leadership. So that leads us now to establishing priorities. That's important. Now, having completed our first step in our hermeneutic, the biblical explanation and the case study regarding life of our time, it's necessary to move to the second step, and that is practical application. The establishment of priorities is the place to begin. Limitations of time and energy will always result in some tasks being done while some remain undone. Without clearly established priorities, a ministry professional has no way of discerning if the tasks done were in fact the right tasks to do. Another way of stating the same thought is that we can be very efficient in being very ineffective. The necessity of establishing priorities can hardly be overstated. J. Oswald Sanders, in his excellent book, Spiritual Leadership, devotes an entire chapter to the leader and his time. He captures in that chapter the essence of priorities. Quote, "Time can be lost, but it can never be retrieved. It cannot be hoarded, it must be spent, nor can it be postponed. If it is not used productively, it is irretrievably lost. In the face of this sobering fact, the leader must be meticulously careful in the selection of his priorities. Comparative values of opportunities and responsibilities must be carefully and seriously weighed. He cannot afford to squander time on that which is of only secondary importance while primary things are screaming for his attention." End quote. Time is limited. Thus, it is important to decide upon the number of hours that one can reasonably expect to invest in ministry on a weekly basis. With no chapter and verse upon which to draw, the number I chose when I was in the pastoral ministry may seem somewhat arbitrary, and so I'll speak autographically because this is my experience. While serving in the pastorate, I chose 55 as the guideline for the number of hours worked in a week. While this number must always remain fluid, it has been a benchmark both for me in my ministry planning and my ministry evaluation. On the one hand, 55 was chosen because it is more than 40. Well, what do I mean? Well, pastors expect lay people employed full-time, 40, 50 hours a week, to invest hours over and above their jobs into the life and ministry of the church. On the other hand, 55 is less than 75. When 75 hours are invested week in and week out, the drain becomes apparent, and the law of diminishing returns is set into motion. Also, at 75 hours, there's a good chance that the pastor is not taking a full day off, thereby violating the Sabbath principle. Violation of the Sabbath principle will always produce negative spiritual consequences. One last reason for choosing 55 hours is the desire to maintain proper life priorities. My first priority in my life is the Lord, both in relationship with Him and obedience to Him. My second priority is to my family. My third priority is to my ministry. When and if these priorities become inverted, everyone and everything suffers. Before establishing and listing priorities, one final question needs to be addressed. How many priorities can be managed successfully? Here again, we face a choice. It is the choice between ministry mediocrity and ministry excellence. Many church observers are convinced that mediocrity has reached an epidemic proportion in evangelicalism. My upper limit of major priorities at any one time is 5. Based upon the many pastors I've met with over the years, I'm convinced that one of the main occupational hazards we face is the attempt to fulfill an indefinite number of priorities that are undefined. That is a recipe for 1 part disaster, 2 parts mediocrity, and 3 parts burnout. At the risk of sounding like double talk, when priorities are listed, they must be listed in order of priority. This listing will impact the amount of time devoted to a priority, as well as how we manage it within our weekly schedules. With all of this being established, here are the ministry priorities that guided me during my 36 years as a senior pastor. They never changed. Number 1, preaching, teaching God's Word. Number 2, equipping lay people for the work of ministry, aka my EE involvement. Number 3, leadership development. Number 4, counseling, including marital, premarital, conflict management, life crises. And number 5, ministry team management, called administration. Often I called it the management of ministry. Little did I know at the time, but dialoguing with my first pulpit committee along these lines places me in a minority position. In our discussions, I presented my understanding of the Bible's view of time and priorities. Then I presented the list, one I just had shared with you. A lively time of interaction and discussion ensued with the pulpit committee. By the end of the process, I'm convinced that this area played a major part in my being called as the new senior pastor. In fact, the pulpit committee was convinced that my list coincided with the present state and needs of their local church. Now, a disclaimer is important here. This list does not mean that I will only do things on this list. There are a number of ministries and activities in the church that do require some pastoral time and effort throughout the year. However, there's a great difference between an occasional participation and a regular involvement. This matter could not be more crucial or practical. Continuing on this autobiographical note, one can only imagine the number of invitations and expectations that I, the new senior pastor, should be a member or at least a regular attendee of each committee in the church. None of my 5 priorities would cause me to become a committee member. Therefore, I declined every such invitation. Now, don't get the idea that everyone liked my answer. Aware of such reaction, along with the desire to affirm the involvement of lay people in the work of the church, I did make the request of each committee chairman. I asked that sometime during the first year, I could spend time with the committee for 3 reasons: to hear of their purpose and priorities for their ministry, to present my understanding of the role of their particular ministry and committee, and to answer any questions they might have. After that first year, I only attended committee meetings when there was an express purpose, and then only for the set amount of time for that purpose. So in reality, I rarely attended meetings, rather choosing to work through elders and staff members who were on that committee. There's a second example of the practicality of publicly established priorities. It was not until months after I became the senior pastor that I realized that my predecessor spent 20 or more hours every week visiting shut-ins, nursing homes, and hospitals. If you remember my list, you will notice that visitation was not there. So the conflict of unmet expectations was inevitable. In reality, to a limited extent, visitation is included under counseling, life crises, because entering a hospital is a life crisis. So I would always visit the person the first time as soon as they were admitted to the hospital. But I would not return for another visit unless the situation warranted. Similar visits were made to nursing homes and shut-ins during times of life crisis. Well, my predecessor who'd visited, well, he had been visiting some people 4 or 5 times a month. So you can only imagine that to go from being visited 4 or 5 times a month by the senior pastor and not being visited at all would create an issue, and that issue was simmering. And I knew that the elders knew that the issue was simmering. Therefore, I brought it up at the next meeting myself. Boy, were they relieved when I took the initiative. After discussion among the group, I reminded them of the priorities that had been established and accepted at the commencement of my pastorate. While I'm sure this is a paraphrase, in essence, here is what I said. I said, I am a man under authority. You as the elders have given me the authority for the spiritual nurture and oversight of this church. Therefore, if you as a body decide that visitation of shut-in and nursing homes is to become one of my priorities, I will gladly do it. However, since my time and energy will only allow me to accomplish 5 priorities with excellence, which of the current 5 will you take away from me? Well, this generated some even greater interaction that I've ever heard among a group of church leaders. In the end, my priorities were left intact. However, outside the meeting room, the unmet expectation remained. Thankfully, a support base and a creative alternative were established to effect a solution. The elders committed to publicly supporting the pastor and explaining the rationale. The creative alternative provided the impetus for a giant step forward in lay leadership development. Until this time, the elders were engaged in little direct ministry or contact with people in the church. So they agreed to the tending of the specific needs of shut-ins and nursing home residents and hospitalized, and because it was important, they agreed to do it. Second, the role of the elders was strengthened through that direct personal ministry with members and friends of the congregation. So we trained the elders and equipped them to participate in the visitation ministry. The results were immediate and positive. First, the elders experienced a transformation from a group that met together to a group that ministered together. Second, the spiritual relationship between the congregants and the leadership rose to a higher level of respect and appreciation. And third, the multiplication of ministers resulted. Even after elders finished their term of official ministry on the board, many continued to remain in visitation involvement. There was another important ingredient that contributed to the success of the alternative. It was agreed that the senior pastor was to visit the shut-ins and nursing home residents twice each year. At Easter, I would visit and serve communion. During December, I would visit and take a poinsettia as a visible reminder of the care and support and prayers of the church family. Now, these are autobiographical, just 2 of many examples of the practical benefit of clearly established ministry priorities. I can't make one for you, and you can't make that list for me. So now we get into reporting and accountability. Remember, I said at the beginning of this session that there is the problem of ministers being overworked, and there's a problem of ministers who are lazy, who are being underworked. And so reporting and accountability is very important. In a society where money and time remain largely unbudgeted, few people have a realistic view of how either is invested. I suspect that the average American spends more money eating in restaurants than they realize. The same is true regarding the amount of time watching television or reading magazines or talking on the telephone or any number of items that would never be listed as high priority. For the ministry professional, effective time management requires having an objective record and measurement on how he is using his time. To quote one more time from Oswald Sanders, "It is a salutary and revealing exercise to keep a faithful record of how each hour is spent in a normal week, and then to analyze it in the light of spiritual priorities. The result may be startling, even shocking in terms of spiritual values. One undoubted result would be to convince the experimenter that he has much more time than he is productively using," end quote. Just as it takes the investment of money to make money, so it requires the investment of time to maximize the usage of time. In a very practical discussion of the making of a Christian leader, Ted Engstrom underscores this point when he says, "Evaluation of time is worth every minute, but most of us won't do it unless we consciously set time aside. A daily time to make up a things to-do list should be a habit. Setting times of monthly, quarterly, and yearly review will build the process into the regular work we need to do each day. Don't be misled into believing that planning for tomorrow is useful only for groups. Goal setting and planning must become a personal style of life if we are to be truly effective." So, some initial action points. Many times the issues we face loom rather large. The larger the issue, the easier it is to do nothing because we're overwhelmed. Somehow, the familiar has become very comfortable and safe. Taking control of one time may appear to be a task requiring too much of a time commitment. If, on the other hand, there is a desire to invest time, gifts, and energies into the highest priorities of God's call upon a life, these 3 action points should be considered. They're not exhaustive, just a primer to get going. Number 1, develop a list of ministry priorities. It is an absolute imperative. In doing so, take into consideration the biblical model for ministry, the unique gifts and abilities the Lord has given, and the specific ministry situation in which you are now serving. Second, commit to a system of effective time management. Keep it simple, but do it. I have used one over the years. I hesitated to include it here because I don't want you to try to copy that, but simply to say to you, find a way like a one-page summary to be able to sit down on Monday and go back the previous 7 days and have a record of how you invested your time in your ministry priorities over that last week. Thirdly, and this is probably the hardest one, learn the discipline of saying no without an explanation. In fact, Douglas J. Rumford actually wrote an article, How to Say No Graciously. And he makes these helpful observations. It's a positive statement of this principle that sounds rather negative. Quote, "The freedom to say yes to important concerns comes from the discipline of saying no," end quote. Since the needs will always outstrip our time and resources, this discipline is imperative. Here is an extremely strong statement of this principle by Keith Brown. "You cannot last in pastoral ministry until you have the courage to disappoint people. If we cannot say no, the professional ministry will become a burden too great to bear."